Imagine a commander. He infects his own soldiers with a deadly disease, and he does so knowingly. Many people who first hear about this think it is madness. But that is exactly what George Washington did. He ordered that smallpox, considered one of the deadliest diseases of the time, be deliberately spread among his own soldiers. Moreover, it was not enemy soldiers who carried it out. It was his own doctors. He had this order carried out even though he knew some of his men would not be able to withstand the disease and might even die. Many people find it hard to believe that a commander could make such a decision. But all of this is recorded in historical sources. At first glance, it seems like a huge mistake. So, was this actually a strategy that no one noticed? Or was it a risk so great that no commander would dare take it? Before we continue, if topics like this interest you, do not forget to subscribe. Now, let us find out together why George Washington made such a decision. In the winter of 1777, George Washington faced two enemies. One of them wore red coats, carried muskets, and could be seen across an open field. The other could not be seen at all. It moved through his camps in the air the men breathed, on the blankets they shared, in the crowded huts where they slept shoulder to shoulder. It killed far more of his soldiers than the British ever did. Its name was smallpox. To understand what Washington was up against, you have to understand what this disease actually did to a person. It began like a bad fever, aching bones, a splitting headache, vomiting. Then, a few days in, the rash appeared, small red spots that rose into bumps, and the bumps filled with fluid, spreading across the face, the arms, the chest, even inside the mouth and throat. In the worst cases, the whole body was covered. Between 1 in 10 and nearly 1 in 3 of those who caught it died. Those who lived were often left blind, or scarred for the rest of their lives by deep pockmarks across the face. For an army, it was a catastrophe waiting to happen. Soldiers lived packed together in filthy, freezing quarters, exactly the conditions the disease loved. One infected man could bring down an entire regiment. Whole hospitals were filling with the sick, and men lay dying in barns at the very height of the illness, with almost nothing to ease their suffering. And here was the truly dangerous part. The British soldiers, coming from a crowded island where smallpox was constant, had mostly caught it as children and survived, which left them immune for life. Many of Washington's men, farm boys from thinly settled country where the disease was rare, had never been exposed at all. They had no protection whatsoever. This created a cruel imbalance. The same outbreak that would barely touch the British ranks could sweep through the American army and gut it. In a straight contest of disease, the Americans would lose, and they would lose badly. Washington understood this threat in a way most of his officers did not, and the reason was personal. He had faced smallpox himself, and he carried the proof of it on his own face. Years earlier, as a young man of 19, Washington had sailed to the island of Barbados with his ailing half-brother. It was the only time in his entire life that he would ever leave the American mainland. While he was there, he caught smallpox. He was gravely ill for weeks. He survived, but the disease left faint scars on his nose and cheeks that he would carry to his grave. It also left him with something far more valuable: immunity. Having beaten the disease once, he could never catch it again. So Washington knew from the inside two things his younger soldiers did not. He knew how close this illness could bring a strong man to death. And he knew that once you had survived it, you were safe forever. That second piece of knowledge is the key to everything that followed, because there was a way. a strange and frightening way, to give a man that same lifelong safety on purpose. It was dangerous. It was banned in places, and Washington was about to bet his entire army on it. The method was called variolation, and to modern ears it sounds almost insane. To protect a healthy person from smallpox, you deliberately gave them smallpox. Here is how it actually worked. A doctor would take a small amount of fluid or matter from the sores of someone suffering a mild case of the disease. Then he would make a shallow cut, usually in the arm, and place that infected matter directly into the wound. The healthy person would then come down with smallpox. But, and this was the whole point, an infection taken in through a cut in the skin tended to produce a much milder illness than one breathed in through the air. The patient would get sick, sometimes seriously, but was far more likely to survive. And once recovered, they were immune for life. The practice had traveled a long road to reach the American colonies. It had been used for centuries in China, India, Africa, and the Ottoman world before it ever reached the West. But it came with a terrible catch. Variolation gave you real smallpox. That meant a small number of the people you inoculated would die from the very procedure meant to save them. Roughly 1 to 2 in 100. And during their recovery, which could stretch for weeks, they were genuinely contagious. They could start the very outbreak you were trying to prevent. This was the tool Washington was considering, a cure that was itself a loaded weapon. Given all of that, it is no surprise that Washington did not rush. In fact, for a long time he did the opposite. He hesitated, he worried, and at one point he forbade the practice outright. His caution was not foolish. It was military arithmetic. Think about what mass inoculation would actually mean for a fighting army. You would take thousands of healthy soldiers and, on purpose, make every one of them sick at the same time. For weeks, a large part of your force would be feverish, weak, and unfit to hold a musket. If the British learned of it and chose that exact moment to attack, they could destroy an army that had, in effect, wounded itself. Early in the war, Washington judged this risk too high. He banned inoculation among the troops, fearing it would leave him defenseless at the worst possible moment. But the disease did not wait for him to feel ready. Through 1776, smallpox tore through the American forces, above all in the disastrous campaign in the north around Quebec, where the sickness crippled the army more thoroughly than any British general could have. Soldiers were dying in barns, packed together at the height of the illness. And a second problem was growing. Word had spread that the camps were death traps of disease, and men stopped volunteering. Recruitment was drying up because people were, quite reasonably, terrified of catching smallpox the moment they joined. Washington was being backed into a corner. Doing nothing was no longer the safe option. Doing nothing was starting to look like the surest way to lose. By the start of 1777, encamped at Morristown, Washington reached the turning point. He became convinced that only one course could save his army, and it was the very course he had feared. He would inoculate all of it. On the 5th of February, 1777, he put the decision in writing in a letter to John Hancock, the president of the Continental Congress. His reasoning was blunt. The disease, he explained, had spread so widely that it was now impossible to keep it out of the army by ordinary means. So he had determined to inoculate every soldier who had not already had it, and to inoculate new recruits as fast as they arrived. To one of his doctors, he put it even more plainly, writing that they had more to dread from smallpox than from the sword of the enemy. Read that again. The commander-in-chief of the American Army was stating, in plain words, that a disease frightened him more than the entire British military. This was not a small medical order buried in paperwork. It was one of the boldest decisions of his career. He was choosing to deliberately infect his own soldiers, thousands of them in the middle of a war, and to accept that some of them would die from it, because the alternative was worse. Historians have called it the first large-scale, government-run immunization campaign in American history, and now it had to actually be carried out. Ordering the inoculation was one thing. Carrying it out across a scattered, exhausted, poorly supplied army was another entirely. The logistics were staggering. Every man had to be examined first to find out whether he had already survived smallpox in the past and was therefore immune and did not need the procedure. Those who needed it then underwent the variolation itself, the cut in the arm, the infected matter placed inside. After that came the hard part, a recovery that could last a month, during which the newly infected men were contagious and had to be kept apart from everyone else. This meant setting up whole networks of inoculation hospitals and isolated quarters, staffing them with doctors and nurses, and coordinating the entire effort across different states, mostly by letters carried on horseback. And it all had to be done in secret. This was perhaps the most delicate part of the whole plan. If the British discovered that a large portion of the Continental Army was lying sick and helpless in quarantine, it was an open invitation to attack. So Washington timed much of the inoculation for the winter encampments, when the harsh weather made a British assault unlikely, and worked to keep the sick men hidden and the whole program quiet. He was, in effect, wounding his own army on purpose, and then praying the enemy would not notice until it had healed. Not everyone welcomed the plan. Washington had to fight resistance on several fronts at once, and some of it came from his own side. Variolation was genuinely controversial in the 18th century, and had been for decades. Many people found the whole idea monstrous. To them, deliberately giving a healthy person a deadly disease looked less like medicine and more like a gamble with human lives. And if a patient died, some argued the person who inoculated him was little better than a killer. Several states and towns had strict laws controlling or banning the practice altogether. At one point, the Continental Congress itself had ordered Army surgeons not to perform variolations. Washington was pushing against real legal and moral walls, not just medical ones. He also had to weave the inoculation into the constant flow of new recruits. A steady trickle of fresh, untested men was always arriving, and each one was a potential spark for a new outbreak. So the system had to catch them early. New recruits were to be inoculated and then placed in quarantine before they ever joined the main body of the Army, so that they arrived at the front already immune and no longer a danger to anyone. It was an assembly line of controlled illness, turning vulnerable farm boys into smallpox-proof soldiers, one painful month at a time. The most famous chapter of this effort unfolded during the brutal winter at Valley Forge, from late 1777 into 1778. That encampment is remembered mostly for cold, hunger, and suffering. But it was also a vast center of this quiet medical campaign. At Valley Forge, Washington found himself with thousands of troops who had still never been protected against smallpox. Ordinarily, his careful method was to inoculate men and then hold them in isolation far from the enemy. But he was desperate for soldiers and could not afford to lose the time. So he made another hard call. He ordered that inoculations go ahead right there in the camp itself. It was a real gamble. If the quarantine failed, he risked igniting an outbreak in the very heart of his winter quarters. But he judged that the men, even while recovering, could still be rushed to the lines if the British forced a battle. It was a bet placed under enormous pressure, and it held. Across that winter at Valley Forge and other sites, the great inoculation went forward. By the end of 1777, something on the order of 40,000 soldiers had been inoculated. Think about the scale of that. In an age with no understanding of viruses, no modern medicine, and a deeply divided public, Washington had pushed tens of thousands of men through a dangerous procedure, and out the other side, protected. The suffering army of Valley Forge was, without most of the world noticing, becoming something no enemy could infect. So, was it worth it? The numbers give a clear answer. Before the campaign, smallpox and other sickness had been hollowing out the army from within. By some measures, the share of soldiers too sick to serve had climbed as high as around a third of the entire force. After the inoculation program took hold, that figure fell dramatically, down toward roughly 1 in 10. An army that had been quietly bleeding men to disease was, for the first time, made largely safe from its most feared killer. Aside from scattered outbreaks, smallpox never again seriously threatened the main Continental Army for the rest of the war. Historians have not been shy about what this meant. Many regard Washington's decision to inoculate the army as one of his most consequential acts of the entire war, and some argue it was critical to the survival of the revolution itself. Consider the logic. An army destroyed by disease cannot win battles, cannot hold together, cannot outlast a stronger enemy. A force that loses a third of its strength to sickness is already half beaten before the fighting even starts. By defeating the invisible foe, Washington kept alive the very force that would eventually wear down the British and secure American independence. The victory that history remembers on the battlefield rested in part on a victory almost no one saw, won not with cannon or cavalry, but with a lancet and a month of fever. Step back and look at the whole of it, and the achievement is remarkable, even by modern standards. Washington was not a doctor. He commanded no medical training and lived in an age that did not even know germs existed. Yet, facing an enemy he could not see, he correctly identified the greatest threat to his army, chose the only tool that could stop it, and pushed that tool through against fear, against law, against the advice of cautious men, and against the very real risk that it might backfire and kill the soldiers he was trying to save. He carried the memory of the disease on his own scarred face, and he used that hard knowledge to protect thousands who had never faced it. It is easy, looking back, to see only the great battles of the Revolution, the crossings and the surrenders, and the famous fields. But some of the most important victories of that war were never fought with muskets at all. They were won in cold hospital huts, in the careful timing of a winter, in the quiet courage of a decision that could have ended in disaster. Washington's war against smallpox is one of those hidden victories. He forced his entire army to face a controlled version of the very thing that terrified them most, so that it could never destroy them. And in doing so, he may have saved not only his soldiers, but the revolution they were fighting for. Today, this decision may seem quite ruthless to many people. After all, it is not something that can easily be accepted. A commander knowingly infecting his own soldiers with a deadly disease. But Washington's greatest fear was not losing a few soldiers. What he truly feared was surrendering his entire army to an epidemic he could not control. As we have seen today, sometimes the hardest decision a commander has to make is not to attack the enemy. It is to take a huge risk to save his own soldiers. Now, I would like to leave you with a question. If you were in Washington's shoes, would you still give the same order, even knowing that some soldiers might die because of it?